December 14, 1703. Edo, Japan. A merchant's house in the Kensington district stands quiet in the pre-dawn darkness. When neighbors finally approach the wooden structure later that morning, they find something impossible. The front doors have been breached. Inside, everything is systematically destroyed, not ransacked but methodically dismantled, piece by piece. Wooden screens lie shattered. Silk has been torn from walls. But it's what the servants discover in the courtyard that stops their hearts cold. 47 pairs of large dog tracks circle the property in perfect formation. Paw prints in the frost lead directly to the bedchamber of Lord Asano Naganori, the man whose death had sparked all of this. But Lord Asano has been dead for 2 years. He cannot be assassinated twice. He cannot be targeted for vengeance by animals acting under command. Yet the evidence suggests exactly that. But the truth was far more terrifying than any of this. Before we uncover the truth about the Ronin's revenge, the 47 masterless samurai who allegedly used trained hounds to track their enemy, make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell. We're uncovering the darkest stories of history that have been buried for centuries. Drop your location in the comments below. Where are you watching from tonight? We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers. Now let's begin. To understand what happened in the winter of 1703, we must first understand the rigid, suffocating hierarchies of Edo period Japan. This was a time when honor wasn't merely personal. It was institutional, systemic, absolute. A samurai's life wasn't truly his own. It belonged to his lord. Every action, every breath, every moment of existence served a single purpose: loyalty to the daimyo, the feudal lord who held his fate in iron hands. The year was 1700. In the peaceful streets of Edo, the capital of the Tokugawa shogunate, there lived a man named Lord Asano Naganori. He was a daimyo of moderate power, ruling from his castle in the Akko province. By all accounts, Asano was an unremarkable man, neither particularly cruel nor exceptionally kind. He was precisely what a lord of his station should be: disciplined, controlled, predictable. He managed his retainers with competence. His lands produced adequate rice yields. His household was stable. He had a wife. He had ambitions. But in 1701, everything fractured. The shogunate had summoned Lord Asano to Edo for official ceremonies. It was routine. It was normal. It was the kind of administrative theater that happened dozens of times each year. Asano traveled with his retainers to the palace, each step of the journey marked by protocol, each moment governed by ceremony. They arrived in Edo in March. The weather was turning warm. Cherry blossoms were beginning to fall. Inside the palace, Asano was to perform his duties as a feudal lord, receiving instruction from the shogun, conducting formal obeisances, maintaining the delicate dance of power that held the entire nation together. It was 1701, and the Tokugawa shogunate had ruled unopposed for nearly a century. Peace, enforced and absolute, had settled over the islands like a suffocating blanket. There hadn't been a significant rebellion in living memory. Samurai were becoming administrators, warriors were becoming accountants. The age of great military glory had passed, and in its place came something worse: boredom, stagnation, the slow death of purpose. For men like Asano, raised to fight and kill and serve, this peace was a kind of torture. But he endured it, he accepted it, he played his role. Until, on the 21st of March, 1701, something inside him broke. The official court records describe what happened next in careful clinical language. Asano drew his sword inside the palace, the greatest possible violation of law and honor in the capital. In the sanctum of the shogun's power, within the very walls that represented order itself, Asano attempted to kill a Kur. Tea official named Kira Yoshinaka. Security moved quickly. The sword strike was intercepted. Blood spilled on the palace floors. For the Tokugawa shogunate, it was an unthinkable crisis. Kira Yoshinaka survived, wounded but alive. Lord Asano was arrested instantly. The interrogation was brief. Asano confirmed everything. Yes, he had drawn his sword. Yes, he had attempted to kill Kira. Yes, he understood the penalty. 42 days later, on May 21, 1701, Lord Asano Naganori was ordered to commit seppuku, ritual suicide by disembowelment. It was the only possible response to his crime. For the shogunate, mercy would have meant weakness. Asano accepted his sentence with silence. He died with his honor seemingly intact. A man who had violated the code but paid the ultimate price. What authorities didn't expect was that his death was only the beginning. When a daimyo was executed for serious crimes, his lands were typically confiscated by the shogunate. This was the law. This was the system designed to prevent rebellious lords from accumulating power. But it also meant something more devastating. Lord Asano's retainers, the nearly 500 samurai who had served him, suddenly had no master. They became ronin, masterless. In the rigid hierarchy of samurai society, this was a form of social death. They had no honor, no purpose, no place in the world. Among these, ronin was a man named Oishi Kuranosuke, the senior retainer and highest-ranking samurai in Asano's former household. Oishi was in his 50s, an elderly man by the standards of the era. He had served Lord Asano faithfully for decades. The loss of his master was more than a loss of employment. It was the destruction of his entire identity. For a time, Oishi seemed to accept his fate. He withdrew to his residence. He lived quietly. Some witnesses reported seeing him drinking heavily, losing himself in sake houses, appearing to give up on life. This was how a defeated ronin was supposed to behave. This was the accepted performance of shame. But by 1702, whispers began to circulate through Edo. Strange meetings, coded letters, visits from other ronin late at night. The first truly suspicious incident occurred in October of 1702. A merchant named Tokoro reported to local authorities that he had been followed by multiple men over several days. The men had taken no hostile action. They had simply observed him. When security forces confronted them, they scattered into the night. When eventually captured and interrogated, the men claimed to be acting under the orders of former retainers of Lord Asano. But their target was not the merchant himself. It was the information he carried. Tokoro worked as an informant to Kira Yoshinaka, the man Asano had tried to kill. The men following him were attempting to gather intelligence about Kira's movements, his security, his daily routines. The authorities dismissed it as isolated. Desperate ronin looking for work, they assumed, criminals seeking any purpose. It was noted in the official records and largely forgotten, but it was the first thread in what would become a conspiracy of extraordinary scope. By early 1703, more incidents were reported. A fishmonger near Kira's residence claimed that someone had been bribing him for information about his lord's household. A servant working in Kira's kitchen was approached by an unknown man who offered money in exchange for details about the family's daily schedule. A gardener reported being questioned about the layout of the grounds, the locations of doors and windows, the positions of guards. Each incident was small, each was individually explainable. A merchant's house had been robbed, yes, but such robberies happened constantly in Edo. A servant had been approached, with money, certainly, but servants were always targets for recruitment by criminals and agents. The pattern existed only if you were looking for a pattern, and the Edo authorities, comfortable in their peace, weren't looking very hard. What made these incidents truly disturbing, however, was the emergence of reports about animals. Multiple witnesses near Kira's household had described seeing large dogs, unusually large, unusually disciplined, circling the property at night. The dogs were described as moving in formation. They were obedient to commands given by men shrouded in darkness. Most disturbing, the dogs were said to have been trained to track scent, to locate specific people in the darkness, to move with military precision. In the testimony of a servant named Yuki, recorded in the Edo police archives, she described what she witnessed on 3 separate occasions in the summer of 1703. Large hounds, 4 or 5 of them, would appear near the gate around the hour of the wolf, 2 a.m. They moved as though they were soldiers themselves, circling the property in patterns. When the men commanding them whistled, just once, a soft sound, the dogs would respond immediately. They never barked. They never howled. They were silent as death itself. The men would point toward the servant quarters, and the dogs would investigate, their noses pressed to the ground, sniffing beneath doors and windows. It was not natural. Such discipline in animals is not natural. The authorities documented these accounts. They questioned witnesses. And then, almost deliberately, they moved on. Perhaps they couldn't imagine such a thing being true. Perhaps they didn't want to imagine it. The idea that 40 or 50 ronin might be systematically planning something, using trained animals as part of an organized assault on a court official. It was too elaborate, too coordinated, too sophisticated. The Edo period had known peace for generations. Surely such things belonged only to older, darker times. By September 1703, a more troubling pattern emerged. 4 separate properties connected to Kira or his associates had been burglarized. Nothing obvious had been stolen. No gold, no jewelry, no valuable objects. Instead, the thieves had taken architectural drawings, property maps, documents detailing the layout of buildings. They had photographed, in essence, every location where Kira might be found. They had made detailed studies of routes between the palace and his residence, noting where guards stood, where shadows pooled, where a man might move unseen. The merchant Tokoro came forward again, this time with more urgent testimony. He had been approached directly by a ronin named Chikara, who had made an offer: serve as a guide, provide information about Kira's movements and security, and be paid a substantial sum. When Tokoro refused, Chikara had become threatening. Your cooperation, he had said quietly, might determine whether you live to see the next winter. Tokoro reported this to his superiors in Kira's household, who in turn reported it to the Edo authorities. An investigation was ordered. But by the time officials began searching for Chikara, he had disappeared. He was one of dozens of ronin who had vanished from their known residences in the summer of 1703, their movements becoming invisible, their connections fractured and hidden. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Something was being planned, something organized, something that would require the coordination of dozens of men, the careful gathering of intelligence, the systematic preparation of an assault. But against whom? For what purpose? If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button now. The mystery only deepens from here. Share this with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. Comment below with your theories. Is this possible? Could a group of ronin really execute something so complex? Let's discover what happens next. The night of December 14th, 1703, began like any other winter night in Edo. Snow had fallen earlier in the day, blanketing the streets in white, muffling sound. Lord Kira Yoshinaka retired to bed around the hour of the rat, midnight. His household guards were posted at their usual stations. The doors were locked. The interior of his residence was organized according to careful practiced security procedures. The man Asano had tried to kill had learned to live defensively. Sometime between midnight and the hour of the ox, around 2 a.m., the assault began. What happened next was documented by multiple witnesses, some of whom were in houses adjacent to Kira's property. The official investigation records, preserved in the Edo Castle archives, describe the events with remarkable detail. Their accounts are corroborated by testimony from survivors, guards, and the perpetrators themselves. The first sign something was wrong came from the dogs. Multiple witnesses reported that between 12 and 20 large hounds appeared on the streets surrounding Kira's residence. They moved in organized groups, circling the property like soldiers establishing a perimeter. They were silent. This was what struck everyone who testified about them. Dogs by nature bark, they howl, they make noise. These animals remained completely silent, responding only to hand signals and barely audible commands from men who moved with them. The dogs began a coordinated assault on the barriers surrounding the property. They attacked the wooden fences and gates with what witnesses described as almost mechanical precision. They did not fight with chaotic animal rage. Instead, they worked systematically, focusing their efforts on specific weak points in the barriers. They worked together, with some dogs attacking while others waited, fresh animals replacing tired ones. The assault lasted nearly an hour, and by its conclusion, multiple sections of the fence had been breached. What happened next would have been impossible without the dogs creating these breaches. As the sun rose on December 15th, investigators found what would shock all of Edo. Nearly 50 men, the exact count would be debated, had broken into Kira's residence using the gaps the dogs had created. They had moved through the house with military precision, each man knowing exactly where to go, exactly what to do. They had overwhelmed the guards systematically. They had moved through the darkness as though they could see perfectly. And they had found their target. Lord Kira Yoshinaka was in his bedchamber. What the investigators found when they examined the body suggested that he had been cornered, trapped, unable to escape. The wound pattern suggested not a quick death, but a deliberate, drawn-out execution. Multiple wounds, multiple attackers. The kind of killing that was meant to be humiliating, personal, designed to erase the target not just from life but from dignity. The ringed-in compound was in complete chaos. Property had been systematically destroyed, not stolen, but demolished. Screens had been smashed, furniture had been overturned, documents and records had been scattered and burned. It wasn't mindless destruction. It was calculated elimination of evidence, methodical removal of anything that might identify the perpetrators or provide clues to authorities. The dogs had vanished by the time morning arrived. They had disappeared into Edo's streets as mysteriously as they had appeared. Only their tracks remained, dozens of paw prints in the frost, each one telling a story of deliberate, organized action. Animal handlers from the shogunate's own facilities examined the prints and confirmed what everyone was thinking. These were not wild dogs. These were trained animals, professional, disciplined, deadly. What made this discovery truly terrifying to the authorities was the unavoidable conclusion: this had been an act of coordinated, deliberate vengeance. This had been an assassination carried out with military precision. This had been organized by men who had spent more than a year gathering intelligence, planning every detail, preparing every element of this assault, and they had succeeded completely. The dead body of Lord Kira was proof. The systematic destruction of his residence was proof. The coordinated assault that had penetrated security that was supposed to be impenetrable, that was proof. And everywhere, marking the assault, were the tracks of the dogs, the instrument of vengeance, the tool that had made it all possible. The Edo authorities responded with immediate, severe action. Lord Kira's death was a catastrophe for the Tokugawa government. It demonstrated that even a man under the shogunate's protection, a man at the center of power's circle, could be murdered in his own home. It showed that the peace the Tokugawa had maintained was fragile, that the old samurai codes of vengeance hadn't been eradicated. They had merely gone underground, waiting for opportunity. Search parties were dispatched throughout Edo and the surrounding provinces. Soldiers were mobilized. A massive manhunt was organized with the explicit goal of capturing the perpetrators before they could escape or organize further attacks. The shogunate's security forces were put on complete alert. Within days, confessions began. The first came from a ronin named Akira, who was captured as he attempted to flee the city. Under interrogation, he revealed the existence of the plot. A group of ronin, led by Oishi Kuranosuke, had been systematically planning Kira's death for nearly 2.5 years. Their purpose was simple: vengeance for Lord Asano. Kira Yoshinaka was blamed for provoking Asano's initial outburst, blamed for the Lord's execution, blamed for the destruction of the Asano household. What made this revelation truly shocking was the systematic nature of the conspiracy. There were at least 47 ronin involved. The exact number varied in different accounts, but witnesses consistently spoke of nearly 50 attackers. These men had been organized into different groups, each with specific responsibilities. Some had gathered intelligence, some had recruited the animals, some had handled logistics, some had organized the actual assault. It was a conspiracy of remarkable sophistication for an era when such coordination was difficult and dangerous. The question that authorities immediately grappled with was the animals themselves. Where had the dogs come from? Who had trained them? How had ronin, displaced, impoverished samurai, managed to obtain a pack of large, disciplined hunting dogs and train them for military purposes? The investigation revealed something even more disturbing. The dogs hadn't been obtained through normal channels. Instead, they had been purchased from sources throughout Japan, brought together over nearly 2 years, and trained by specialists who had been recruited or coerced into service. One handler, a man named Tosuke, came forward during the investigation and revealed that he had been paid substantial sums to train the dogs in formation movement, scent tracking, and coordinated assault tactics. Tosuke's testimony was chilling. In a recorded statement preserved in the Edo archives, he described how the ronin had brought him a young, ferocious mastiff and asked him to train it for special purposes. When he had asked what those purposes were, they had been vague. Only gradually, as he worked with the dogs, did he realize he was training them for an organized assault. When he attempted to refuse, he was threatened. When he attempted to disappear, he was found and brought back. He continued training until the night of December 14th. I trained them, Tosuke later testified, to move as one body, to respond to silent commands, to ignore pain and distraction. They were not wild animals by the time that night came. They were weapons. I had transformed them from dogs into instruments of death, and I did this willingly and under duress, both of which are true, both of which are shameful. The assault had been executed flawlessly, precisely because everything had been planned obsessively. For more than 2 years, Oishi Kuranosuke and his co-conspirators had studied Kira's routines. They had mapped his residence. They had analyzed his security. They had gathered intelligence on every aspect of his life. And they had incorporated the dogs specifically because the dogs could accomplish what human attackers alone could not. They could breach barriers quickly and completely, creating the openings necessary for the ronin to penetrate the defenses. By late December 1703, The investigation had identified nearly all of the conspirators. Over the following weeks, they were arrested. Oishi Kuranosuke, the leader, was captured and brought before the shogunate for trial. The trials were brief and the verdicts predetermined. This was not a matter of justice. This was a matter of managing the crisis. The shogunate needed to demonstrate that conspiracy was futile, that vengeance was impossible, that the new order of peace could not be disrupted. Between January and March of 1704, sentences were carried out. Oishi Kuranosuke was allowed to commit seppuku, a privilege granted because he was a samurai of rank and the leader of the conspiracy. He died with apparent acceptance of his fate. The other conspirators were not granted this mercy. Some were beheaded, some were executed by crucifixion, some were drawn and quartered. The penalties were severe and public, designed to instill fear and demonstrate the absolute authority of the shogunate. For the dogs involved in the assault, the fate was equally grim. They could not be tried or executed in any legal sense, but they were systematically hunted down and killed. Every dog that could be connected to the conspiracy was slaughtered. The goal was to erase even the memory of animal involvement, to prevent any future Ronin from considering using dogs in similar conspiracies. But what happened to the animals created its own mythology. In the years following the Eiko Revenge, as it came to be known, there were persistent rumors about a stray pack of dogs that wandered Edo's streets, supposedly the descendants of the animals used in the assault, supposedly still loyal to the ghost of Oishi Kuranosuke. Whether these were real or legend, they terrified people. For decades, stories circulated about travelers attacked on roads by packs of dogs that seemed too organized, too coordinated, moving with apparent purpose. Whether these were exaggerations, whether they were real instances, misinterpreted through the lens of the Eiko Revenge, whether they were pure fabrication, it was impossible to know. What authorities could not prevent was the shift in how this event was perceived. Despite the brutal punishments, despite the attempt to portray the Ronin as dishonorable criminals, a different narrative emerged in Japanese culture. The 47 Ronin came to be seen not as criminals but as heroes, men who had sacrificed their lives for loyalty to their lord. The fact that they had used dogs, that they had planned an assassination, these details were glossed over in favor of a simpler story. Men of honor who had avenged their master despite knowing it would cost them their lives. This narrative became so powerful, so central to Japanese cultural identity, that it essentially erased the actual complexity of what had occurred. The dogs were removed from the story. The conspiracy was simplified into a moral tale. The targeting of Kira became justified as honorable vengeance rather than murder. The Eiko Revenge became a tragic story of loyalty rather than a horrifying example of what happened when the old samurai codes collided with the new regime's attempt to enforce centralized order. The Eiko Revenge, as shocking as it was, revealed something profound to the Tokugawa shogunate. The old samurai codes were not dead. They were dormant, buried beneath the surface of peace, beneath administrative order, beneath the suffocating protocols of the new age. The ancient ideals of loyalty, honor, and vengeance still had the power to motivate men to extraordinary acts. More than 40 samurai had been willing to sacrifice their lives, not in glorious TTLA, but in careful planning, in patient intelligence gathering, in the methodical execution of an assassination. The shogunate's response was to strengthen its control even further. New laws were enacted to prevent masterless samurai from gathering in groups. Regulations were established for animal ownership and training, with particular restrictions placed on the breeding and training of large dogs. Intelligence services were expanded. Surveillance of potential dissidents was intensified. What began as a response to one assassination became a systematic effort to prevent any possibility of such coordination happening again. But the cultural response was different. Artists began creating woodblock prints depicting the 47 Ronin. Playwrights wrote dramas about their loyalty. Poets composed verses about their sacrifice. What the authorities had intended as a deterrent became instead a legend, a story that redeemed the men who had committed murder by framing their murder as an act of virtue. This narrative had profound effects on Japanese culture for centuries. The idea of the loyal Ronin avenging his master became a central archetype in Japanese literature, theater, and eventually film. The story was told and retold, each telling adding new details, new dramatic elements, gradually erasing the inconvenient realities. The dogs were forgotten. The careful intelligence gathering was simplified into a heroic charge. The assassination became an execution of justice. The criminals became heroes. More immediately, the Akko revenge had substantial legal consequences. The incident demonstrated that the shogunate's authority could not rely merely on military power. It required complete control over society's ability to organize. New rules were established regarding the registration and ownership of weapons. The carrying of swords was further restricted. Gatherings of ronin were prohibited. Travel was regulated. The shogunate essentially created the infrastructure for a surveillance state, all in response to one organized assassination. The case also prompted intense study of animal behavior and control. Military scholars across Japan became fascinated with the possibility of using trained dogs in conflict. Some daimyo commissioned similar animal training programs. Some scholars wrote treatises on the proper use of animals in warfare. Others warned against such practices, arguing that the Akko revenge proved how dangerous it was to elevate animals to instruments of deliberate murder. This obsession with the animals involved in the assassination created its own documentary tradition. Historians and chroniclers compiled detailed accounts of the dogs' training, their behavior during the assault, their characteristics. The most extensive account comes from a scholar named Saikaku, who interviewed survivors, guards, and animal handlers years after the events, creating a detailed reconstruction of the dogs' role in the conspiracy. In Saikaku's account, the dogs are described with an almost supernatural quality. They are portrayed as having moved with unnatural coordination, as having understood complex commands, as having operated with a kind of military discipline that seemed impossible for animals. Whether this was exaggeration, whether it reflected the genuine sophistication of the training, or whether it reflected the psychological impact of being attacked by organized animal force, it's impossible to determine from the historical record. What's clear is that the Akko revenge created a lasting impact on how Japanese society thought about the intersection of loyalty, violence, and power. For the shogunate, it was a crisis to be managed and contained through force and control. For the culture at large, it became a template for understanding heroism and sacrifice. And for those who studied military strategy and tactics, it provided a vivid, documented example of how carefully planned conspiracy could achieve what seemed impossible. The REVENGEThe also had immediate practical consequences for other potentially rebellious daimyo. The shogunate used the Akko case as a precedent in subsequent disputes, arguing that any challenge to central authority would be met with overwhelming force and the systematic destruction of the perpetrators and their allies. The message was clear: the peace enforced by the shogunate was absolute. Resistance was futile. Vengeance would be crushed without mercy. This didn't eliminate rebellious impulses. Samurai culture was too deeply rooted in concepts of honor and loyalty for that. But it did drive such impulses underground. Instead of open rebellion, there would be careful planning and hidden conspiracy. Instead of military challenges, there would be assassination and terror. The Akko revenge demonstrated both the vulnerability and the brutal power of the Tokugawa state. It showed that even the most careful security could be penetrated by determined, organized opponents. But it also showed that any such opposition would be met with total, merciless destruction. In the centuries following the Akko revenge, the story evolved. The historical reality, the conspiracy, the assassination, the careful use of trained animals, the brutal suppression of the perpetrators, gave way to a legendary account that emphasized loyalty and honor while downplaying the actual violence and murder. The 47 ronin became symbols of virtue rather than examples of what happens when old codes clash with new authority. The dogs, the actual instruments of the assault, disappeared from the cultural narrative almost entirely, replaced by more dignified images of swordsmanship and honorable combat. But the truth, preserved in official records and historical documents, remains. This was an assassination carried out with extraordinary planning and sophistication, assisted by trained animals operating under human command, and suppressed through absolute violence by a state desperate to maintain control. It was not a glorious tale of samurai honor. It was a dark example of what violence becomes when combined with careful planning, organizational skill, and the willingness to use any means necessary to achieve a goal. The legacy of the Akko revenge was not a celebration of loyalty but a demonstration of how power maintains itself through fear and control. The 47 ronin received some mercy in the form of ritualized death rather than torture, but only after their networks had been destroyed, only after their co-conspirators had been hunted down and eliminated, only after the shogunate had demonstrated that such conspiracy was ultimately futile. What this event truly reveals about human nature is darker than most Japanese cultural narratives acknowledge. It shows that loyalty can be exploited into becoming an instrument of murder. It shows that organization and planning can turn desperation into effective violence. It shows that even the most powerful authority structures contain vulnerabilities that can be exploited by determined opponents. And it shows that when the state feels threatened, the response is not measured or proportionate, it is total, overwhelming, and designed to prevent any possibility of repetition. What drove Oishi Kuronosuke to spend more than 2 years planning an assassination he knew would cost him his life? Was it genuine loyalty to his dead lord? Was it refusal to accept the new order that had rendered him powerless? Was it something darker, the need for significance, for purpose, for one final moment where his actions would echo through history? Leave your theories in the comments below. This is Fear Sermon, uncovering the hidden histories that shape nations and revealed the darkness at the heart of human ambition. Subscribe for more lost chapters of Japanese history and the world's strangest, most terrifying true events. Ring that notification bell so you never miss an upload. What did you think of this investigation? Have you heard of the REVENGEThe before? Drop your thoughts below. Share this with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. See you in the next video.